Could you expand a little on the difference between migrants and refugees?
So I want to start with the legal definition of a refugee. A refugee is defined as someone who has fled their country of origin due to a well-founded fear of persecution. Now, in contrast, a migrant is often defined as someone who is moving from one country to another to find opportunity, to find a better life. They may be moving for economic reasons. They may be moving to be reunited with family or to seek better educational or work opportunities. And the main distinction here between refugee and migrant often comes down to this idea of presumed choice or presumed agency. Is it your choice to leave your country of origin? Is that choice voluntary? Then you're a migrant. Are you being forced out? Are you unable to return without fear of persecution? Then you're a refugee. You're recognized as a refugee under international legal instruments. Now, another way that this often gets talked about is with push and pull factors. And this is the notion that migrants are sort of pulled voluntarily towards opportunity and they choose to move accordingly. In contrast, a refugee gets pushed out involuntarily. I really like the definition that comes from the International Rescue Committee, the IRC. They talk about migration involving both push and pull factors, but forced migration gets characterized by a greater weight or a number of push factors. So on the one hand, I want to be clear that the differences between refugees and migrants can be really stark. But on the other hand, these distinctions can get really complicated and can get blurred very quickly when we look at who gets granted refugee status, who is seen as having a legitimate claim to asylum, and the kinds of conditions that they're leaving behind. Because there is a degree of human discretion built into these systems of asylum and what can seem like arbitrariness of setting and meeting quotas. We can glimpse some of this when we look at the number of refugees, for example, admitted to the US and how much they have varied across administrations, knowing that at the moment we are at this all-time high of refugees globally, and we have in recent years been at a historic low for resettlement. And just as important is recognizing the circumstances that do not qualify one for asylum, such as environmental and economic precarity, social cleansing, the proliferation of gang violence, and the systematic violence against women. For example, all factors driving families and children out across Central America. These are horrific factors that are driving movements. Yet that movement often gets classified as voluntary rather than forced. It's very, very difficult to be granted refugee status or even asylee status if you're leaving behind these kinds of conditions. It's not uncommon to see terms and labels like refugee and migrant used as if they're the same, even by politicians who are shaping some of the policies that impact these classifications. And so I think it's natural to see some confusion and some conflation around these legal terms, but also really important to pull them apart and interrogate what is distinct about these experiences, as well as the risks and legal affordances that can accompany these classifications. Internally displaced peoples, or IDPs, generally outnumber refugees, but they're less visible. They're very difficult to count. And again, the distinction comes back to international law. So refugees are covered by legal frameworks for protection, going back to this 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. And by contrast, there's no legally binding instrument that upholds the rights of IDPs. So they fall to national actors and national decisions. And again, this can be very problematic when governments themselves are implicated in the displacement of internally displaced populations. One last thing I'll say is that these distinctions can be really fluid, even for those who have had these categories at one time or another.